Morning. The history of New Bern is one that's strong with stories of remarkable women, and we are talking about a few of those on today's program, and we're very proud of the contributions that they made to the history of our town. It was difficult for me, having grown up in New Bern, to imagine that there were actually places where people considered women to not be strong, because there were so many legendary women in our history and even in our present. We're standing in front of a building at the corner of Middle Street and Broad Street, and we often associate this wonderful building, which now is the home of the Chelsea restaurant. We often associate this building with Caleb Bradham, and of course his drugstore, which moved from the corner of Middle and Pollock to the corner of Middle and Broad. And of course, as you walk into the Chelsea, you see many memorabilia that remind you of Caleb's business there. As interesting, or perhaps even more importantly in terms of the history of this building, is the fact that it was built by an African-American entrepreneur in New Bern in 1912. Now, if you can imagine, in 1912, things were difficult. Not only for women here, but especially for African Americans. It was the height of Jim Crow, and it's hard to imagine that there would be an African American female entrepreneur who would have the resources and the ability to construct a building like this in downtown New Bern. But Lucinda Stanley was such a woman, and her story is truly remarkable. It's hard to walk past this building or to walk into the Chelsea without thinking of the courage and foresight of a woman like Lucinda Stanley. As we prepare to walk in the front door of this wonderful restaurant, I'm remembering that Lucinda Stanley, who built this building and who owned this building, in those days would have had great difficulty using the front door. Yet the same white men who owned businesses in this area, while they would not allow her to come in the front door, they paid her rent. So let's walk in. Hey, how you doing? Now let's go down to the corner of Middle and Pollock and look at another New Bern landmark associated with the strong women in our history. Here at the corner of Middle and Pollock Streets, I'm standing in front of a wonderful tree, one of New Bern's most beautiful trees. And this great landmark is associated with one of New Bern's strong women, Miss Molly Heath, who was a legendary teacher, educator here in New Bern. In fact, she was my father's first grade teacher, and she was much beloved by her students, both at the school here, but also as a teacher at Christ Church Sunday School. And those students chose to plant this wonderful tree in her honor, and of course it's always beautiful year-round, but it's particularly beautiful at Christmas when it's all illuminated with thousands of bulbs. In fact, to me, it's my favorite Christmas tree in all of New Bern. So whenever you're in downtown New Bern and you happen to pass this beautiful tree, remember that it's the Miss Molly Heath tree, and is really a tribute to all of the educators who have made this town great. Now, just 2 blocks north from here is another one of New Bern's great architectural landmarks, First Presbyterian Church. Our particular interest at First Presbyterian today is to talk a little about another one of New Bern's strong women. Standing here in front of New Bern's First Presbyterian Church, this wonderful federal structure reminds us again of the importance of women in New Bern's history. There were so many important women in the founding of this church. And among them, we're particularly interested today in one woman, Kitty Green Stanley, who was an African-American woman who participated in the founding of the church. The family played a prominent role in the early days of this church. Let's go inside and look around a little. Among the plaques lining the walls of this church celebrating the founders is one dedicated to the memory of Ms. Kitty Green Stanley. And it's certainly appropriate when we're talking about strong women in New Bern's history to talk about Kitty Stanley. She was born a slave, and after acquiring her freedom and marrying John Carruthers Stanley, who himself had been born a slave and was the half-brother of John Wright Stanley Jr., the son of John Wright Stanley, by an African mother. Kitty Green Stanley eventually became one of the founders of First Presbyterian Church. Interestingly, in those days, enslaved African Americans would have sat up in the galleries of the church, but free African Americans, particularly of the prominence of the Stanley family, would have found their pews, their family pews, on the main floor of the church. And this plaque, in fact, is mounted next to where the Stanley family pew would have been. To the memory of Ms. Kitty Green Stanley, who departed this life in 1823, a free person of color, one of the founders of this church, wife of John Carruthers Stanley, another one of the remarkable strong women in New Bern's history. Just a little further down the wall from Kitty Stanley's plaque is one in memory of Mrs. Frances Pollock Devereaux, another one of the founders of this church, and the daughter of Ms. Eunice Edwards Pollock Hunt, who herself was one of the founders of this church, and of course associated with Jonathan Edwards of the Great Awakening. One of the members of this family who has contributed greatly to the history of New Bern is a dear friend who is the niece of Bayard Wooten. Mary Barden has been kind enough to speak with us today about Bayard.
Okay.
Well, Mary, you've graciously agreed to talk today a little about a couple of members of your family. As you know, we're doing a piece on strong women in New Bern's history, and it's wonderful to hear from one of New Bern's legendary strong women, yourself,
for goodness sake,
about members of your family who were wonderfully strong women. And I thought we'd start by talking a little about Mary Bayard Clark. And if you could tell us a little bit about her and who she was and her importance in North Carolina and New Bern history.
Oh, Mary Bayard Clark was a delightful woman. She had so many talents, it'd be hard to even it's hard to even talk about them. One thing, she was quite lovely, and she got was known for her wit. She came from a prominent family in Raleigh. They owned a number of plantations, and as a little girl, she became an excellent horsewoman. In fact, when they finally lived in Texas, she was known about the best horsewoman that was known around. But she wrote poems. She wrote beautiful poems. By the time she was 15 years old, she had quite a reputation. And then I stumbled on, as a little girl, I'd always heard about my famous great-grandmother that wrote my poetry. And I didn't know she wrote other things. And I stumbled on the fact that she was quite a journalist. And what she would do would be write articles and then send them to various newspapers all over the country. And before too long, she had quite a reputation as a journalist instead of just a poet.
And her pen name when she wrote
yeah.
was what?
Was Tanella. That was taken from, because when she lived for a while in Louisiana with her aunt, who was the wife of the bishop, Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana. And she lived there because her fiance was William Clark. He was the head of the North Carolina troops in the Mexican War. And she felt closer to him in Louisiana than he in Mexico.
I think it's wonderful that you and your husband, Graham Barden, well known as Barty, when you built your home and this area was created out on the Trent River, that your home is on Tanella Road.
That's right. And another reason I forgot to tell you, she picked Tanella because all these ladies that she knew in Louisiana used the names of flowers for their pen names. And her father definitely did not want Mary Bide to put her personal name before the public, as he said. So until he died, she used Tanella. And then immediately she used her own name, as Mary Bide Clark.
Well, Mary, I know that you, of course, along with Terry Crow, you co-authored a book, Live Your Own Life, which is the family papers of Mary Bide Clark. And
that was her motto.
Where that title came from, her motto?
From her motto.
And what do you think she meant by that, live your own life?
Well, she quite described what she meant. She said that she did not like having to take the clothes that were laid out on the bed for her to put on. She wanted to select her own things. She wanted to write her own pieces and not have somebody else tell her how to do it. And that's exactly, she wanted her children to be quite open with what they wanted to do with their lives and not be determined to do it somebody else's way.
Exactly. So well, now her granddaughter was also a very well-known, strong woman from this area, and many people have, of course, heard of her. She was Bayard Wooten, well-known photographer, and tell us a little bit about Bayard Wooten.
All right. I knew Bayard well as a child, and into my early married life, I knew Bayard. She was a very determined person. She would do things, she wanted to do things her way, so I think she inherited this strong independence from her own grandmother.
And of course, most of us know her, she was a wonderful artist, but most of us know her primarily as such an important photographer, and those photography genes are strong in your family because she partnered with your father, George Moulton, and I was lucky enough to know both of them when I was a young boy, and they were wonderful partners in the photography business, were they not?
Well, yes, that's true. Daddy did not consider himself an artist, and I don't think he really was an artist. But he was a hard-working man, I know that, and he did. When Bayard asked George to come to work for her, she asked him in a way about him doing the business part of the business. And this was fine because he could cope with that very well. And there was an awful lot of just plain hard work that goes with photography. And Bayard would, as she got more into it and realized that she could take a picture in much less time than she could paint a picture. The fact that when the Wright brothers, of course, they had their first airplane, it was just an amazing amount of excitement about that. And she went, they were going to come to New Bern and give rides at the fair, the county fair. Anybody that would pay could go up in this airplane, which was one of the first that the Wright brothers had ever built. And so Bayard went over there and he looked at it and thought that would be good publicity for her business and said, I'm going to go up on the plane. Well, her mother didn't know about this until the newspaper came out with headlines, "Wooten to make the ascent." Holy mackerel. Her mother said a fit and made her promise if she went up this time she would never fly again, and she never did. In the book that has been written about her called Light and Air, it tells about that experience of her going out to get in the plane, and they're very open. These planes in those days didn't have all kinds of things around you, and she was sitting on a crossbar with the camera which she held between her legs so she could take pictures of New Bern, and they actually still exist. Did you know that? These pictures of New Bern do.
Pictures still exist, which
at
is
Chapel Hill.
Yes, which is quite wonderful. So many of Byard's pictures are there, and other
like
places.
250,000.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. And of course, during New Bern's 300th, we had a wonderful exhibit here in New Bern of some of her
pictures,
but there are so many, and they are so remarkable. They've certainly stood the test of time. Well, with these strong women, and what's wonderful, Mary Byard Clark, of course, thanks to you and Terry Crow, there's this wonderful book, Live Your Own Life. And then Jerry Cotton produced that wonderful book on Byard Wooten. So it's no wonder with these women in your ancestry, and of course I knew when I was a boy, I knew your mother. In fact, right here on this property, I used to come out, and she'd bring a bunch of us, pile a bunch of us in the car and come out to this area and go swimming and eat watermelon and pick grapes. And there were no houses out in this part of Trent Woods at that time, and it was really always a great adventure. But it is no wonder that with women like that in your past, you are the strong and remarkable woman you are, and, what a treat it's been to know you my whole life, and to have the chance to talk with you for this television program. You're certainly a great North Carolina treasure, and you come back naturally. It's true, and you come back naturally.
I think, Nelson, you're carried away.
I am carried away, but with because I know you well. If I didn't know you well, I wouldn't feel so strongly. But what a great North Carolina treasure, and again, one of those remarkable women in New Bern's history of truly remarkable women.
So, that's that.
That's that. So I think